What if I told you there was a time, not too long ago, when being black in America meant there were whole parts of life you were simply not allowed to touch? Not because you couldn't afford it or because you didn't belong there, but because the law, or worse, the unspoken rules of the South said you didn't have the right to. Do you remember what it felt like to live with those invisible walls around you? The 1960s are often remembered for change, civil rights marches, freedom songs, and that feeling that the world might finally turn toward justice. But for millions of African Americans, that decade was also a daily reminder of what they couldn't do. Things as simple as taking your child to a park, having a meal in a restaurant, or trying on a hat in a store. These weren't neutral experiences. They were acts of quiet resistance. Let's go back, not as tourists of history, but as witnesses, to remember the everyday things African Americans were forbidden to do in the 1960s and what it felt like to live through them. Bus segregation. You couldn't sit just anywhere on the bus. You remember that, don't you? The front rows were reserved, white only. If you were black, you sat in the back, and even then, you'd better stand up if a white passenger needed your seat. The seats weren't just divided by a line. They were divided by centuries of arrogance and fear. The air was thick with the hum of the engine and the silent calculation of dignity versus safety. You didn't argue. You just moved, even when it burned your pride. Now, you hop on a bus today, sit where you like, scroll through your phone, and think nothing of it. But back then, every step toward that front seat could get you arrested. Or worse, can you imagine how heavy those simple rides felt? Water fountains. You couldn't drink from the same water fountain. And it wasn't just about thirst. It was about humiliation. The white fountain was cool, chrome, and spotless. The colored one, usually off to the side, was old, chipped, maybe barely working. It didn't just say, "You can't drink here." It said, "You are less." The sting wasn't in the water. It was in the sign. Today, when you grab a drink from a public dispenser or refill your bottle at the airport, do you ever think about how many people fought just to take a sip from the same tap as everyone else? Restaurants. You couldn't eat in certain restaurants. If you were traveling through the South in the 1960s, you had to plan your meals carefully. You carried food from home or relied on the Negro motorist green book to find safe places to stop. Because most diners, even the ones that smelled like heaven with fried chicken and coffee brewing, would refuse you at the door. You might see the sign, "Whites Only," swinging gently in the wind above a neon-lit entrance. And even if hunger gnawed at you, you knew better than to walk in. If you dared to sit down at that counter, you'd face sneers, insults, maybe fists, and yet some did. Some sat anyway, quiet, steady, unshaken, knowing that their presence alone was an act of defiance. Think about that next time you order food from anywhere. No second thought about who's allowed to serve or sit beside you. Public parks and beaches. You couldn't take your children to every park or swim at every beach. Cities maintained separate recreation areas, white playgrounds with new swings and clean sand, and colored ones tucked in forgotten corners, with rusted slides and broken benches. Even water wasn't equal. Some beaches were patrolled by local police who made sure the line stayed clear. A rope in the water, sometimes invisible, sometimes enforced by men with batons, said you belonged only on one side. Imagine the sound of the waves, so free, so wide, and being told they weren't for you. Now, when you watch families gather under the sun without a second thought, you can't help but remember that there was a time when the ocean itself felt segregated. Movie theaters. You couldn't sit where you wanted in the theater either. In many southern towns, African Americans were sent upstairs to the balcony, what they called the colored section. You could hear the laughter, smell the popcorn, and feel the cool air from below, but you weren't part of that world. Sometimes you had your own entrance, a narrow stairway on the side of the building, so you didn't pass through the main doors. The seats were older, the view wasn't as clear, but you still went, because escaping into a movie, even from up there, gave you a few hours where color lines blurred in the dark. Now you can walk into any cinema, sit where you please, lose yourself in the story. But back then, the story outside the screen was always the same. You were reminded of your place before the opening credits even began. Libraries and education. You couldn't use the same libraries or the same books. Some cities had entirely separate library systems. In others, you could only enter on certain days or check out books that white readers no longer wanted. Children would walk miles to small, underfunded colored schools, often sharing one textbook among several students. Pages torn, covers faded, but you studied anyway. You read by lamplight. You learned from hand-me-downs because knowledge wasn't just power, it was hope. And today, when you see a child tapping away on a school tablet surrounded by books and free Wi-Fi, you can almost feel the echo of what your parents and grandparents must have dreamed of, a world where learning didn't come with a locked door. Voting rights. You couldn't always vote, even though you were a citizen. On paper, the 15th Amendment said you could, but in practice, they made sure you couldn't. You remember the tests, don't you? Literacy tests that had nothing to do with reading and everything to do with humiliation. How many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Name all 67 judges in the state. If you stumbled, if you hesitated, they'd stamp denied across your name. Then there were the poll taxes. Small sums for some, impossible for others. You'd save pennies from your paycheck, only to watch the registrar tear up your application anyway. And yet, people kept trying. They stood in lines that stretched around courthouses, in the heat, in the rain, in the shadow of men with rifles, just to cast a single vote. Now you walk into a polling station and slide your ballot into a machine in seconds. But in the 60s, that act was a battle cry. Every X marked on paper was an act of courage. Hotels and travel. You couldn't stay just anywhere when you traveled. Hotels, motels, even gas stations had their unspoken rules. No coloreds, no Negroes. The Green Book wasn't a luxury, it was survival. You carried it in your glove compartment, thumbed through its worn pages, praying to find a safe bed for your family before nightfall. Picture this: the hum of the highway beneath your tires, the kids in the backseat asking when you'll stop, and the sinking feeling when you see another vacancy sign flicker off as you pull up. You'd sleep in the car sometimes, doors locked, a blanket across your lap, because even rest was segregated. Now you check into a hotel with a few taps on your phone, greeted with smiles at the front desk. But for many, that simple comfort was once a forbidden dream. Hospitals and healthcare. You couldn't be treated at every hospital. Many white hospitals refused to admit black patients, no matter how sick they were. In emergencies, you'd be turned away at the door, told to try the colored hospital down the road, even if that meant losing precious minutes. And when you got there, supplies were short, equipment outdated, and doctors overworked. Mothers gave birth in crowded wards. Children recovered in rooms without air conditioning. Even blood transfusions were segregated. They labeled vials by race. Think about that, segregating life itself. Now you walk into an emergency room and expect care, no questions asked. But back then, survival depended on your zip code and the color of your skin. Job opportunities. You couldn't apply for many of the jobs you qualified for. Employers would take one look at you, one glance at your address, and say, "We'll call you," but they never did. Factory work, sales positions, even clerical jobs, doors closed quietly, and when you did find work, you were paid less for doing the same labor. Some towns even had white job listings in the newspapers. Black workers were kept to janitorial or field labor, no matter their education. Yet you showed up every morning, pressed your shirt, did the work, because dignity didn't depend on permission. It came from endurance. Today, job applications are online. Names are typed, not spoken. Bias still lingers, but the walls aren't as visible. Still, can you feel how heavy it must have been to walk into an interview knowing the outcome before you even sat down? Clothing stores. You couldn't try on clothes in certain stores. Imagine walking into a shop, running your fingers over a new dress or suit only to be told you can't put that on. They said it was about hygiene, but you knew better. It was about control. You could buy it if you had the money, but you couldn't test the fit. So you'd hold the fabric up to your shoulder, estimate in the mirror, and hope it looked right once you got home. There was a quiet shame in that, but also defiance, because you were still claiming space in a world that wanted you invisible. Now you see fitting rooms lined up, mirrors bright, clerks smiling at everyone the same way. But back then, even fashion carried the sting of segregation. Swimming pools. You couldn't swim in most public pools. Some cities drained the pools completely when integration was ordered, just so white families wouldn't have to share the water. Imagine that, choosing to destroy something rather than share it. In many neighborhoods, the colored pools were smaller, old, or non-existent. You'd swim in rivers or creeks instead, places that carried both freedom and danger. But those moments, kids splashing, mothers laughing, were acts of rebellion. Joy became its own protest. Now, community pools are just another summer stop. But when you close your eyes and listen to the sound of water today, remember, once it echoed with the weight of exclusion. Public restrooms. You couldn't use every restroom. Traveling across the South, you'd see those signs again, white and colored. The white bathrooms were cool and clean. The colored ones, if they existed at all, were usually behind the building or in disrepair. For black women especially, that humiliation was relentless. To be denied basic human needs, to hold it in while watching others walk freely in and out, it was a small cruelty repeated 1,000 times a day. Now, public restrooms are everywhere, shared by all. But every door that swings open today carries the memory of those that once stayed shut. Churches You couldn't worship everywhere. Even the house of God was segregated. Some churches outright banned black congregants. Others created separate entrances or designated pews in the back. But faith doesn't bow to barriers. So black communities built their own churches, places that became more than sanctuaries. They were schools, meeting halls, headquarters for the movement. When the world refused your humanity, the church reminded you of it. Now, when gospel choirs and church bells ring across all colors and congregations, you can feel the echo of those who refused to let segregation reach their souls. Amusement parks and fairs. You couldn't enjoy the same rides or attractions. White-only parks posted guards at the gates. For black families, that meant watching laughter and music from beyond the fence. Some parks had colored days, usually once a year, an insult wrapped in charity. So you made your own joy. You built your own carnivals, your own fairs, your own spaces where children could run free. Joy became a declaration. We exist, we feel, we celebrate. Now think about the ease of buying a ticket to Disney or Six Flags without fear. The laughter is the same, but the freedom behind it was paid for. Marriage and relationships. You couldn't marry freely, not if the person you loved was white. In many states, interracial marriage was illegal until 1967, when the Supreme Court finally struck those laws down in Loving v. Virginia. But before that, loving someone across color lines could mean arrest, exile, or violence. Black and white couples lived like fugitives in their own country, sneaking away to other states to say their vows, knowing their union wouldn't be recognized back home. Families were torn apart, communities whispered, and lawmen made examples of them. Now, love is still not always met with acceptance, but at least it's legal everywhere. You can hold the hand of the person you love in public without fearing the sheriff's car pulling up beside you. But for those who lived before 1967, love itself was a rebellion. Neighborhoods and housing. You couldn't buy or rent just anywhere. Realtors, banks, and city zoning laws worked together to keep black families out of white neighborhoods. They called it redlining. Entire maps were drawn with red borders, marking the areas where banks wouldn't lend to black buyers. Even when you had the money, you were told, "This house just sold," or "We're not taking new tenants." If you did move in, harassment followed. Slashed tires, broken windows, or worse. The American dream had boundaries that didn't appear on paper, but you could feel them every time you tried to cross. Now, neighborhoods are more mixed, but the echoes of those maps still shape where opportunity lives. Every time you see a house with a "for sale" sign, remember those who couldn't even get their foot in the door. Schools and integration. You couldn't send your child to every school. Even after Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the reality of integration moved at a snail's pace. In the early 60s, many southern states openly defied the ruling. Some shut down public schools entirely rather than allow black and white students to learn side by side. So you saw brave children, just kids, walking through mobs, escorted by soldiers, books clutched to their chests. They faced screams, spit, and thrown stones just to sit in a classroom. Think about that. They were children asking for nothing more radical than an education. Now kids ride the same buses, share classrooms, and complain about homework together. But it's because those before them walked through fear so others could walk through open doors. Police and justice. You couldn't expect fair treatment from the law. The badge didn't mean safety, it meant danger. A routine stop could end in jail or worse. You didn't raise your voice, you didn't reach for your pocket, you didn't even run if you were innocent. Because in the eyes of the system, your innocence didn't matter. The jails were full of people charged with disturbing the peace or loitering, crimes invented to remind you that your freedom was conditional. Even black veterans returning from war, men who had fought for the country, were beaten for wearing their uniforms in the wrong town. Now the conversations about justice still echo, but at least the law can be challenged, recorded, exposed. Back then, silence was your only witness. Voting juries and civic duty. You couldn't serve on juries, even though verdicts affected your life. All white juries decided cases involving black defendants, and the outcome was almost always the same: guilty. It wasn't justice, it was performance. Your civic duty was stripped away before it even began. You paid taxes, worked, lived by the law, but the law didn't see you as part of it. You were a subject, not a citizen. And yet the fight for inclusion didn't stop. Black lawyers, activists, and organizers filed lawsuits, built coalitions, and forced the country to confront its hypocrisy. Now, jury duty might feel like a chore to some, but to those who remember that era, being called to serve means something sacred. It means you finally have a voice in the system that once shut you out. Barbershops and beauty salons. You couldn't go to every barbershop or salon. The white-owned ones refused to cut black hair, claiming they weren't trained for that texture. It wasn't just about grooming, it was about dignity. So black entrepreneurs built their own spaces, and those spaces became community sanctuaries. A haircut wasn't just a service, it was connection, laughter, advice, debates about politics and sports, and the soothing buzz of the clippers. It all lived there. Black barbershops and beauty parlors weren't just businesses, they were survival centers. Now, you see stylists of every background learning to work with every texture, but the pride that came from creating your own space? That's the part that never changed. Public transportation beyond buses. You couldn't ride trains or airplanes the same way either. On trains, the colored car was always near the back, hotter, dirtier, noisier. Dining cars often refused black passengers altogether, forcing them to bring food from home. Air travel was worse. Many airports in the South had segregated waiting areas and bathrooms. Some airlines quietly denied black passengers boarding if seats were overbooked, always choosing to bump them first. Flying, that symbol of freedom, was just another reminder of limitation. Now, when you pass through airport security, boarding pass in hand, think about those who were grounded long before the plane even left the runway. Public pools and country clubs. You couldn't join most country clubs, swim teams, or golf courses. Leisure wasn't considered your right. If you wanted to play, you built your own. Black golf leagues, community centers, small private clubs made from nothing but willpower and a patch of land. Even tennis courts were contested ground. Players like Arthur Ashe broke through barriers not just with skill, but with composure under open hostility. His victories weren't just athletic, they were political. Now, when you see athletes of every color playing side by side, it's easy to forget how recent those locked gates were. But every open clubhouse today stands on the shoulders of those who built their own when no one would let them in. Military service. You couldn't serve equally in the armed forces. Though integration officially began in 1948, discrimination lingered well into the 60s. Black soldiers were given the hardest, most dangerous assignments. Promotions came slowly, if at all. In some bases, even the mess halls were still divided by race. And when they came home, medals on their chest, honor in their stride, they couldn't eat in the same restaurants as the white men they fought beside. Think about that. To defend freedom abroad, only to be denied it at home. Now, the military is one of the most integrated institutions in America. But every salute, every uniform today still carries the memory of those who saluted equality before the nation did. Shopping and department stores. You couldn't walk freely in the big department stores downtown. Even when your money was good, your presence wasn't welcome. Security guards followed you through aisles. Clerks ignored you. Dressing rooms were off limits, and restrooms were marked for white ladies only. So black shoppers learned to navigate the insult. Polite smiles, quiet dignity, eyes straight ahead. You bought what you needed, but never forgot the sting behind the transaction. The act of spending your own money became an act of quiet protest. Now everyone strolls through malls and stores without thinking twice. But for those who lived through it, consumer freedom came wrapped in the memory of exclusion. Workplace segregation. You couldn't rise in the rank. Even in industries that hired black workers, promotions had ceilings. The boss might say, "You're a good worker, but this position isn't for you." White employees with less experience were given titles, while you were told to be grateful. So you worked twice as hard for half the recognition, not because you were accepted, but because you had something to prove to yourself, to your children, to history. Now, corporations boast diversity programs, but the fight for equal opportunity began with those who refused to be silent in the face of invisible walls. Every office today stands on their shoulders. Sports and public games. You couldn't play on the same teams or even in the same stadiums. Colored leagues and white leagues divided athletes by race, no matter their talent. Black players weren't allowed into the major leagues, country clubs, or Olympic training camps, but they played anyway, on dusty fields and backlots, on cracked asphalt courts. And when one of them, Jackie Robinson, Wilma Rudolph, Muhammad Ali, broke through, it was more than victory. It was vindication. Now stadiums roar with unity. Jerseys are sold across the world, and every child, no matter their color, dreams of greatness. But that dream was built on decades of closed doors and stubborn persistence. Freedom of movement. You couldn't simply wander. Police had the power to stop you, question you, demand to know why you were out of your area. Sundown towns made it clear, if you were black, you'd better be gone before dark. So every drive, every stroll after work carried calculation. Which streets were safe? Which towns would look the other way? You learned to move with purpose, never lingering, never assuming safety. Now, freedom of movement is taken for granted. You walk where you please, day or night. But the memory of those curfews still lingers in the quiet corners of America. Everyday dignity. And maybe that was the cruelest part. You couldn't exist freely. You couldn't laugh too loud in the wrong place or challenge a white person's word. You couldn't forget yourself, not even for a sec. Dignity itself was a daily act of resistance. Every handshake, every church service, every bus ride, it all carried risk. And yet, people didn't just survive. They thrived, they loved, they built, they sang, they prayed, and they passed down stories of how they kept their humanity intact when everything around them tried to take it away. Now, when you look around at what's possible, the open schools, the shared neighborhoods, the laughter in public parks, you realize something simple but profound. None of it was inevitable. It was earned. Music and nightlife. You couldn't dance where you wanted to, not in the clubs where the bandstand gleamed under the soft gold of stage lights. In most towns, the music belonged to white patrons, and even when the sound was born from black rhythm and pain, you weren't welcome on the dance floor. In the 1960s, black musicians could headline a white club, but after the last song, they had to leave through the back door. You could be the one making the crowd move, the sax wailing, the bass trembling through the wooden floor, but you couldn't sit down at the bar for a drink. In many southern towns, even the local mixed dance halls had clear codes. Black patrons on weeknights, whites on weekends. The jukeboxes, too, told their own truth. In white diners, they'd remove race records, claiming they were too raw. Today, when you step into a cafe, plug your phone into a Bluetooth speaker, and play whatever song you love, it's hard to imagine that there was a time when sound itself was segregated. Back then, a black artist could be the soul of America's music and still be denied entry to the very spaces their art transformed. Do you ever think about how many songs were written in rooms that wouldn't have let the singer sit down? Movies and entertainment. You couldn't watch a movie just anywhere. Theaters were split down the middle, or worse, stacked. White patrons got the main floor. Black patrons were sent up to the balcony. They called it the Peanut Gallery, a name that stung as much as it mocked. The smell of buttered popcorn drifted up, but the view wasn't the same. You had to crane your neck, looking past the heads of others to see the screen below. Even the stories on that screen didn't belong to you. Hollywood in the 1960s was still painting the world in white, keeping black faces to the margins or making them caricatures. Sidney Poitier was one of the few who broke through. Graceful, dignified, but always carrying the burden of representing an entire people. Now we sit on equal seats, side by side in the dark, and streaming lets every story find its voice. But back then, watching a movie wasn't about escape. It was about endurance. You paid for a ticket just like anyone else, but you were still reminded, frame by frame, that this world wasn't built for you. Do you remember the first time you saw someone who looked like you on screen and didn't feel invisible? Public transportation. You couldn't travel freely, even when you had the ticket. Trains had separate cars. Buses had dividing lines that weren't just painted, they were enforced. In southern stations, white and colored waiting rooms meant you couldn't sit with your own family if your skin was the wrong shade. Imagine standing on a platform under the beating sun, holding your child's hand, knowing the cooler waiting area beyond the glass was off limits. You heard the laughter of passengers inside, the hiss of steam, and you felt the weight of being told, yet again, to wait your turn. The insult wasn't just in the inconvenience. It was in the daily erosion of dignity. Today, trains hum quietly across the country, and you can board without a second thought. But back then, every trip required calculation. What route was safe? What towns to avoid? Who might stop you? You weren't traveling for leisure. You were moving through a map of danger. Can you imagine planning a simple trip and needing courage just to sit down? Religion and church life. You couldn't even worship together. On Sundays, when church bells rang through small southern towns, they rang for two congregations divided by color. The white church stood on Main Street, proud and tall. The black church sat farther off, maybe near the railroad tracks, its paint peeling, but its heart alive. But here's the truth. The separation birthed something powerful. Black churches in the 1960s weren't just houses of prayer. They were fortresses of community. Inside, people found not just God, but each other. The scent of perfume mixed with wood polish, the hum of the choir swelled like thunder, and for a few hours, you were reminded that your life still had worth. While white America worshipped comfort, black America worshipped survival. Those pews held the first whispers of revolution, the same voices that would march in Montgomery and sing in Selma. Now you can walk into any church you choose. But back then, the black church wasn't just a sanctuary, it was the soul of resistance. Do you remember how every hymn sounded like both a prayer and a promise? Military and war service. You couldn't fight for your country on equal ground. During the Vietnam War and the years before it, black soldiers often faced two battles, one overseas and one the moment they came home. In World War II, segregation in the ranks was official. By the 1960s, it was supposed to be gone, but racism didn't evaporate with policy. It lingered, in promotions denied, in barracks divided, in medals unawarded. You might have worn the same uniform, carried the same rifle, and bled on the same field. But when you returned to your hometown, the same old signs still greeted you. Whites only. Imagine risking your life under a flag that didn't protect you at home. Even on base, there were unwritten rules. White officers gave orders, black soldiers carried them out. Yet in the face of all that, many still served with pride, because serving meant believing in a version of America that hadn't yet arrived. Today, when we see veterans honored with parades and ceremonies, it's easy to forget that not every hero was welcomed home. Some had to march for equality after marching for their country. Can you imagine the strength it took to salute a nation that refused to salute you back? Closing reflection. So, the next time you sit at a counter, vote at a booth, walk into a hotel, or drink from a fountain, pause for a moment. Remember those who couldn't. Remember the mothers who packed lunches for the road, the fathers who walked miles to vote, the children who sat in classrooms surrounded by hate but refused to quit. Their courage didn't just open doors, it built the floor you stand on. Because the truth is, the 1960s weren't just about what African Americans couldn't do. They were about how they refused to stay that way. Every barrier became a battlefield, every humiliation became history, and every act of defiance became freedom. Now it's your turn to carry their memory forward. If you remember stories from your parents, your grandparents, or your own life, share them. Drop them in the comments so they're never lost to time. Because memory is power, and power, once shared, never fades. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.